Welcome to the Woven Energy podcast on real practical shamanism with me, Joseph Sikora, and as always, Damon Smith. We are here to talk about shamanism from the ground up. And this week we're here for a Christmas special, and we're going to be talking about mistletoe and the Druids. Now, this is a subject that I know pretty much nothing about, so I'm going to be firmly in the passenger seat for this one, but I'm very excited to hear what Damon has to say. So, but I believe before we get started, we have some Patreons to thank.
We do, mate. Well, we've got all our patrons to thank as usual. But because we did a massive thanking of people on episode 100, the historic episode 100 of Heretics the other week. So I think a lot of our patrons may feel thanked out at the moment, but we'll see, because that took quite a long time. But we are just going to thank the people that we need to thank recently. You guys know why we're saying thank you. So it's Justin Corral, Sam Ribera, Stefan Topolsky, Jesse Borgelt, and Mark Walker. Thanks ever so much, guys, and to all of our patrons. You guys are awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as always, you can go to patreon.com/wovenenergy, and you can support us over there. And Damon, Patreons and supporters, what do they get?
So there's a bunch of different levels on there, and they were made a long time ago, and we probably need to revisit them. But everybody gets thanked. Even the $1 patrons get thanked. And then there's a couple of other levels. It's just, so we have a decent amount of content now in the Patreon members area. A lot of the background to different episodes, but there's actually a bunch of training videos in there now.
Yeah. It's like video stuff, supplementary material to the
and we recorded quite a bit of the Gathering of the Tribe, and actually I had a question about that during the week, which was, have we released all the videos from the Gathering of the Tribe? No, we haven't. And also, we need to start thinking about the Gathering of the Tribe 2024 now, don't we? So yeah, there's still a bunch of stuff to come on there. I've also got a number of the patrons are currently helping me do some research and development work on an upcoming spirit dance course that I'm working on. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff happening, and we tend to stick it all in the patrons area.
And the Gathering of the Tribe it's like a live online, almost like a workshop, isn't it? Where you take a subject and you really run with it for the week. So I believe this year you were talking about the shaman's drum being the main.
Oh, no, that's you mean this year coming 2024 will be the main topic. That's right. Yeah. Last year it was very spirit dancey. We did a bunch of different kinds of spirit dance. We did some Malay spirit dance, Mongolian, some Japanese. Yeah, it was a smorgasbord of spirit dance last year.
Yeah, so basically anybody following this podcast and following along with what we're doing, all of the material is on the podcast, of course, but in Patreon we have extra material, supplementary material, videos, just to hopefully make it a little bit easier to understand. And of course ask questions and just generally get involved. All right, fantastic.
There is also a higher level called Power Patron, and we have a discussion group for, you guys know who you are, the Power Patrons. We talk together online. That's it.
Okay, so Mistletoe and the Druids. Take it away, Damon. I'm very excited to hear about this.
Yeah. So, well, it may be just a bit of an excuse because it's Christmas, right? You know, and it is a great Christmas tradition. It would be very, very easy to turn this episode into a Heretics episode, which I don't want to do. We might do it on Heretics some year. So,
let me know when you do, because I'd love to listen to that one. All about the Druids.
So not too much history, not too much anthropology on this one, because this is a Woven Energy podcast. So we're talking about this tradition of mistletoe in the Western tradition, where it has formed part of the Christmas tradition since before Christmas was invented. It's kind of a hangover from our ancient past as human beings, of people who live in the Isles. I don't want to say British people because that gets into nationality and stuff. But it's also spread around the world. It's a common thing for people to use mistletoe as a decoration at Christmas. And then there's a whole tradition of kissing under the mistletoe, right? So what I would say is that it's like the Christmas tree itself. It's a bit of a hangover from more ancient traditions, pre-Christian traditions that have perpetuated into the present and become part of this celebration of
and become sort of ritualized.
Yeah, ostensibly the birth of Christ in the Christian tradition. But anyway, I'll point you to the Heretics podcast if you're interested in that kind of stuff. It's not a simple situation. We've done hours and hours of stuff around this subject, Emperor Constantine and all that kind of stuff, and the invention of Christianity and all this kind of thing on Heretics. So I'll point you over there. But the tradition of the mistletoe is useful for where we've got to in the Woven Energy podcast. We've talked a lot about level 1 through 3 technique on this podcast historically over several years now. And we've been more recently getting into level 4, and we've done several episodes on level 4 technique, and we will continue to do episodes on level 4 technique. Interestingly, or as a side note, if you don't know what I'm talking about, level 1, 2, 3, and 4 technique, you're probably at the wrong point in this podcast. You need to head back to the start, episode 1, and start.
It's worth just pointing out that this podcast is more like reading a book, right? It's like, it's pretty much you've got to start at the beginning, but we do like to slice in these episodes now and again that are more general interest. But it's like learning a subject from the beginning. So
let's talk about the mistletoe tradition, and it goes back a long way. It's actually noted in quite ancient writings, Greek and Roman writings, as being associated with the religious leaders, the spiritual leaders of the Celts in Europe, which would include what is now the country of Britain. Back in those days, I refer to it as the Isles off the western coast of Europe. But, if you go back far enough, they weren't even disconnected. There was a land bridge, so that definition doesn't work very well either. But I'm not talking, when I say Britain, I'm not talking about countries. I'm talking about these lands. And the inhabitants of these lands in pre-Christian times were Celts. I mean, the Celts weren't here, to the best of our knowledge, the Celtic tradition or the Celtic culture wasn't necessarily here for a great deal of time before the Romans arrived. That's a whole different issue. But at one time, there was a religious, spiritual tradition in these lands that was associated with a spiritual class or caste called the Druids, who were a group among the Celtic peoples that the Romans took for a kind of priestly class or priestly caste. That's obviously the Romans seeing the Celts through their own eyes, because the Celts didn't use writing. It may be that their senior people, their leaders, had the ability to write, and there is some indication that they had a sort of secret language that they could write in, but they also had a kind of ban on writing down their secrets. It was definitely a tradition of secrecy among the Druids, these spiritual leaders of the Celts. The things that are known about them, therefore, are written down by other people, the Greeks and the Romans and others. So I've got a bit of a quote. This is from Pliny the Elder, who's a Roman historian, in his natural history. And it goes like this. We should not omit to mention the great admiration that the Gauls are the Celts in France, have for it as well. The Druids, that is what they call their magicians, hold nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and a tree on which it is growing, provided it is a hard-timbered oak. Mistletoe is rare, and when found, it is gathered with great ceremony, and particularly on the 6th day of the moon. That'll be the 6th day of the month. Hailing the moon in a native word that means healing all things. They prepare a ritual sacrifice and a banquet beneath a tree and bring up 2 white bulls whose horns are bound together for the first time on this occasion. A priest arrayed in white vestments, hence why people think the Druids wore these great white cloaks that you see in modern contemporary Druid imagery, climbs the tree and with a golden sickle cuts down the mistletoe. And if anybody's seen those comics, Asterix the Gaul, you'll know about this collecting mistletoe with a golden sickle, which is caught in a white cloak. They finally kill the victims being these two bulls, praying to a god to render his gift propitious to those on whom he has bestowed it. They believe that mistletoe giving in drink will impart fertility to any animal that is barren, and that is an antidote to all poisons, which is kind of ironic. So that's the end of Pliny's quote. It's kind of ironic that mistletoe is actually poisonous, you know.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
You know, so
okay.
So variably poisonous. But it has actually had a tradition of use in traditional herbal medicine. The image that we have of the Druids in the modern age, and, you know, there are contemporary groups claiming descent from the original Druids, and there's some truth to that. And again, I refer you to the Heretics podcast. For instance, we did an episode on the hill figures, for instance, the Uffington horse stroke dragon, depending on which way you look at it. That was, and other hill figures were created by people who perpetuated ancient traditions within the UK. The Uffington horse being the oldest one, that's proper Iron Age, which would have been either prior to or contemporary with Celts in the UK, possibly prior to, but also all the others, which are to differing extents, hill figures are pictorializing ancient spiritual traditions of these lands that were created during the Christian era, sort of giving a lie to the fact that the Christians completely wiped out this old Druidic religion or spiritual tradition of these lands. Now, I'm immediately going to hasten to add, because you did notice that there were things about tying bulls' horns together and, you know, sacrificing bulls and all that kind of stuff, that I'm not in any way suggesting that Druidism itself, even the historical Druidism, was a particularly shamanistic tradition. Like all things, originally shamanistic traditions, spiritual traditions, when people start living together in settled communities, start to mutate and morph. They start to take on the character of something that underlies and supports the power of the elites within the society. It's very clear from the descriptions that we do have of the Druids that they were very much an exoteric religious group.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, because in that passage they were called magicians, or they were referred to as magicians. But in my mind, when you say a priestly class, I was going to ask you whether Druids equals shamans, but
definitely not
in a Joe basic but question kind of way.
It may be that they, in some aspects of their religion, their exoteric religion, which is a counterpart to Christianity, right? Because Christianity was already around at the time when the Druids were around, or at least the precursors of Christianity. You know, we're talking about stuff like the things in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are awfully similar to Christianity. Their exoteric leaning approach to the world may have preserved more of the underlying shamanistic traditions than perhaps, for instance, our modern contemporary society now, because they were closer to it in time. That's probably a better way to put it. And this use of mistletoe, the symbolism of mistletoe, is an example of that. I mean, the whole bull sacrifice thing and Wicker Man and all that kind of thing. That's you're burning people in a Wicker Man and banging people at the stake are very, very similar activities, you know. But in terms of the mistletoe, again, I feel that these things went back further than the Celts. They went back further than the Druids. And so the tradition, for instance, of mistletoe at Christmas is not just older than Christianity, it's older than the Druids as well. And I'd like to explain why. The plants that we call mistletoe actually break down into 3 families of plants. The Lorantheaceae, the Mesodendraceae, and the Santa, they are Santas in the start of it, Santalaceae. Not saying I can pronounce them that well, the Latin names. They are all slow growing but very persistent, and they are what biologists would call semi-parasitic. They live on a host tree. They're not, growing in the soil with their own roots in the soil. They're on a host tree.
Yeah.
And they live in a lot of, for instance, timber and crop trees and ornamental trees. There's quite a wide variety of trees that they can actually grow on. And in biology, they're known as hemiparasites. And in scientific terms, that means that they rely on host trees for water and some nutrients, but they actually do a lot of photosynthesis. They actually produce their own food through photosynthesis. That's why they're not called full-on parasites. They also tend not to, except in very exceptional cases, they tend not to kill the host tree. It's not really in their interest, right? So in temperate climes, they are pollinated. And this is quite important. The mistletoes, they're pollinated by wind and by insects. And in the tropics, a lot of that pollination is also done by birds. Remember, this is pollination we're talking about, not seed distribution. In all cases, the key is that birds are and again, I refer you to the Heretics podcast's episodes on alchemy and the thing we call the language of the birds. And you'll understand why I'm referring here, but we're going to move on quickly. In all cases, it's bird distribution of the seeds. The birds come and eat these beautiful white fruits on the mistletoe. The seeds are inside those fruits. And the seeds, then the birds fly away and the seeds are in their droppings and they drop on other trees. But also a key aspect of this is the seeds of mistletoe are very sticky. And when the bird's eating the fruit, they tend to stick to the beak. And birds have the behavior of rubbing off the seeds off their beak against the bark of a tree, right? This is the behavior of the birds. And you can see how the mistletoe gets started on a new host tree. The bird eats the fruit on one tree, flies to another one. The seed's stuck to its beak, which irritates it, so it rubs it off against the bark of that tree, and then the seed of the new mistletoe is sown on a new host tree. That's pretty much how that works. And these white berries, obviously, they're very pretty. You've seen them. They're the color of snow. They are taking water from the host tree, often using hydrostatic pressure, in the same way that water moves up the xylem of any tree. But also they use hydrostatic pressure. Some of the species, I've got the name of one genus that does this. It's called Arceuthobium. These ones can actually use that hydrostatic pressure to shoot their seeds quite violently away from the mistletoe plant without the use of a bird. But flying is still involved because these seeds of this particular group of mistletoes can be shot away at up to 50 miles an hour, which is great. I've never seen this.
Nature is just
unbelievable, isn't it?
Insane, isn't it?
Unbelievable, yeah. So host plants range from region to region exactly what these host plants are, but they can be very, very. It's not just trees. The image of the druid climbing up the tree with his golden sickle, but mistletoes are very adaptable. They can grow in ferns. They can grow in grasses as well as trees. They can also use other mistletoes as hosts. You got a mistletoe on a host tree and then a mistletoe on the mistletoe, a different kind of mistletoe on the mistletoe, and so on, that type of thing. And as I said, they rarely kill the host tree. And that would only happen usually when the host is already diseased. And they're not, one of the things that we have to do as kind of miasmatic human beings is put our kind of judgments and prejudices aside. We think, ooh, parasites, that kind of thing. That doesn't sound very nice. But there's other ways to look at these things. If a host tree was already diseased, then the fact that they're taking water and some nutrients away from the tree would be damaging to the tree. And they can also decrease the reproductive ability of the host tree in a similar kind of way. They also form growth. The host trees also form growth in response to the mistletoes, and sometimes these form structures which are known as witches' brooms. They are. So here's our link to Halloween and all that stuff. Mistletoes are native on every continent in the world. That doesn't mean they've been distributed there by human beings. Human action, they're native to every continent in the world except Antarctica for obvious reasons. So it's a very, very widespread way to live. They are toxic, and the toxicity varies not just based on which species of mistletoe you're talking about, but also what the host tree is. Different host trees give rise to different levels of toxicity in the mistletoe, which I find quite interesting. But it's not every mistletoe that people think of when they think of Christmas, right? They think of, Santa Claus and his elves and his sleigh and the mistletoe hanging, I guess, above the fireplace or somewhere in a Victorian house.
Yeah.
And apparently during the Victorian era, this tradition of kissing under the mistletoe, that was perpetuated by the servants in the houses of the rich, apparently. So that's quite interesting. And the variety of mistletoe that everybody thinks of as a Christmas decoration is this thing, Viscum album, which is distributed all over Britain and all the way across Northern Europe, across Northern Asia, where it's native to all of these places. And it grows on trees like hawthorns, willows, lindens, poplars, apple trees, those sort of trees. Yeah. It makes a bush, which you can see in these trees, especially if it's growing on deciduous trees. Well, this is a good time of year. If you had mixed deciduous woodland, it's easy to spot because it's not deciduous, it's evergreen. So you see a deciduous tree that's lost all its leaves, and you see these clumps of mistletoe up in the branches. It's quite easy to spot on that basis, and I guess that's how the Druids found it. It's a good thing to spot during winter. Obviously, they were harvesting mistletoe, which includes berries, right? White berries, at around this time of year running up to Christmas, which means that it flowers very early, right? It flowers in early winter, which would have had some sort of symbolic meaning probably in their tradition. It's marking the end of the year, isn't it? So it's like the flowers and the berries that mark the end of the year. We celebrate late in the year to cheer everybody up around Christmas. Can you imagine what winter, I think I've said this before, can you imagine what winter would be like without Christmas? It wouldn't be the greatest. It'd be a bit of a downer, especially if you're an agricultural society, right? There's nothing growing. There's nothing happening. So what do? We make one of the most fun, I love Christmas, I'm a big fan of it. We make the most fun, wonderful time of the year in the place where everybody's going to be most depressed, which is bang in the middle of winter. Nothing's happening. And so in a way, the mistletoe is also a symbol of this. It's a symbol of this growth that is this spring-like growth that's happening late in the winter. And that would link through, in naturalistic terms, to those little flowers that appear in the hedgerows early in the spring.
So they worship because the Druids. Worship's the wrong word, but they respect the mistletoe because it's one of the very few things that grow in the middle of winter. Then,
yes, in terms of its fertility, right? And remember that mistletoe's also been associated with fertility. People are taking this toxin supposedly to make themselves more fertile. Don't recommend it myself, but you never know.
Yeah.
But it's associated with fertility. And again, it's that new growth. It's that spring-like action. And it's a source of wonder, isn't it?
So there's no link here because I'm curious how and why it's considered a healing property when in actuality it's toxic. And I was thinking maybe that.
So first of all, it's not very toxic. Eating a mistletoe berry is not going to kill you, or very unlikely. I'll just ask you this then.
So, was mistletoe used as a catalyst, as a shamanic technique catalyst then?
Undoubtedly, the Druids used it like that.
Because like you say, and like you said in a previous episode, it's not that a catalyst just provides some change in the system to almost use and latch onto. Cheese, you used, I remember starkly you used cheese as the example,
cheese catalyst,
or sugar.
Yeah,
you can use sugar as a catalyst, and of course we think of psilocybin and we think of all sorts of other things, but
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
mind just immediately went to mistletoe being...
So they would have used it, but I strongly suspect, we don't know, because actually the amount we know about the historical Druids, the ones that were here when the Romans arrived, is absolutely microscopic how much we know about those guys.
Yeah.
There's a lot of traditions associated with the Druids, but my suspicion is based on other traditions that were going on in Europe at the time, is mistletoe would have been an ingredient in a psychoactive concoction, one of several, that was used by the Druids. Because I don't think it would be a very good thing by itself, very useful for that type of thing by itself. But you never know. But what I do know is it's been used throughout time, again in traditional medicine, to treat a whole bunch of different things. So, for instance, anxiety, boosting the immune system, cardiovascular help, treatment for epilepsy. It was widely regarded in Europe for centuries that it was one of the best treatments for epilepsy. And
with some merit or not?
Don't know is the simple answer. I really don't know. I mean, it's something I could look into. I have access to a bunch of, because, given my work, Cambridge University, I have access to a bunch of scientific journals. I can look into that, see if there's any merit in it. Treatment for, watch this space. Treatment for infertility, as we've mentioned already. Treatment for high blood pressure, relief of arthritis, and also in more recent times, cancer treatment, because isn't everything used for cancer treatment? So what I mean is that people have believed that mistletoe is useful medicinally. Whether or not it actually is something I haven't really looked into in a very big way. And in a way, from a shamanistic point of view, that doesn't really matter very much. And what really matters is the symbolism of the mistletoe in terms of understanding high-level technique in shamanism, which is what we'll come on to. So this idea that Viscum album was involved in the spiritual life of the Celts, and then it has become for a long time involved in the spiritual life, because Christianity is the spiritual life of the Europeans, like it or not. And so it maintains that. And when Christianity came into European countries, it didn't sweep away what went before. It took it on. And even when it was created, modern Christianity was effectively invented by the Emperor Constantine. And even when it was created, it took a lot of pre-existing stuff. For instance, Mithraism, we've talked about a lot on Heretics. It took a lot of pre-existing stuff and absorbed it. And when Christianity spread to countries like, for instance, Ireland or Britain or other countries in Europe, it spread quite rapidly, not because everybody was saying, oh, I've just realized Christianity is a much better religion than my folk religion. It spread rapidly because the missionaries weren't stupid. In fact, they were incredibly effective, and the people who they targeted with their evangelism for the new religion were the elites, were the leaders of the society. And if you get the king to convert, then, everyone in those days, everyone pretty much had to convert whether they liked it or not. And that's pretty much how they went about it. And that's why you get these saints who go around converting whole countries seemingly overnight. They haven't converted the whole country, far from it. They've converted the leadership of that country to Christianity. That's what they did. So the mistletoe as a symbol of a spiritual tradition goes back a long way. And as I've said, my feeling is that it went back pre-Celtic. It went back pre-Druidic because of what it represents in shamanistic terms. It's a plant that absorbs, or that depends upon a tree for its life. It absorbs stuff from the tree, water for sure, and some nutrients, but it has its own way of life. It has its own will. It has its own ability to do things as well. It's not depending on the host tree entirely in that way. For instance, its own photosynthesis, it can make its own food. It can absorb sunlight and do things under its own power. And this is why I said, this is why scientifically they're called hemiparasites. The point being here that you've got a kind of analogy for a shaman. If you think of the mistletoe as the shaman and the host tree as the world tree or as Mother Nature, there's a thing called a hostorium. And what the hostorium is, it's a heavily modified root on the mistletoe that penetrates the bark of the host tree and forms a connection through which the water and the nutrients pass. If you look at it under a microscope, if you take a section through a branch, for instance, with a mistletoe on it, and you look at the hostorium in cross-section with the branch in cross-section, you can see that there's not really a clear join there anywhere. The tissues of the host tree, and when we do this in biology, if we were wanting to look at that under a microscope, we actually have to use dyes to colour the different bits to see which bit is the mistletoe and which bit is the host tree. There's a merging there. There's a tea bag in the ocean type of effect going on. It's not like there's just like a socket and the mistletoe is plugged into it, or it's like, like this sort of idea, those aliens that come down from outer space and they put something in your head and suck your brains out or something. It's nothing like that at all. Yeah. It's the tree and the mistletoe are fully merged into each other through the hostorium. And in esoteric artwork in the European tradition, so for instance, especially in the Rosicrucian tradition, the hostorium has been shown as resembling a placenta, like the baby in the womb, its connection to the mother, and it's been built in, the hostorium's been built in spiritual traditions in very much this kind of a way. You think that it's the placenta, and therefore, in a way, the mistletoe is the baby of the host tree. If you think of that in terms of a shaman, what is a shaman trying to achieve? A shaman's trying to achieve a strong connection with nature, a connection with nature that is stronger than that's enjoyed by the average human being. So this symbolism that you get in the Rosicrucian tradition with Hostoria, connecting the esoteric practitioner to the womb of nature, to the world tree of nature, is what the mistletoe thing is all about in shamanic terms. It's a symbol of the connection of the shaman to nature. The mistletoe is connected to the host tree through the hostorium, and the shaman is connected to the world tree through the hostorium. That makes some kind of sense?
Yeah, it does.
But the thing is that mistletoe is quite good at making hostoria, sorry. Mistletoe is quite good at that. It's kind of baked in its genes and it doesn't have to think about it very much. But for human beings who've come under the influence of the miasma, we also are good at making that hostoria naturally as wild animals, but as human beings who are miasmatic, who have been influenced by the development of civilization, by the development of exoteric religion, belief systems. You can go into modern times, capitalism, materialism, all that kind of stuff. We get increasingly bad at that. So one of the ways of asking the whole shaman question is, what's the shaman's hostorium? What is it? What is it that's going to connect the shaman to nature? That connects the shaman's life and spirit and energy to the life and spirit and energy of the natural world in the same way that the hostorium connects the mistletoe to the host tree. And I really like that analogy that the host tree is the world tree and the mistletoe is the shaman. Does that make some kind of sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how when we get more cut off from nature, to get that back, we'll look to analogy then. And then these things like mistletoe appear as almost like that gives us that sense of connection, which has been missing.
Okay, guys, so we've just had a little bit of a problem with the recording setup. Apologies for that. So if you've already heard some of what I'm about to say, then don't worry about it. I'm just going to say it twice. What we were trying to get over, Joe mentioned the idea of an allegory or an analogy for the shaman's relationship to nature. The shaman is represented by the mistletoe, and the world tree, nature, is represented by the host tree. And the modified root that connects the mistletoe to the world tree is the historium. The historium in nature resembles a placenta, and this analogy has been used in esoteric circles, especially Rosicrucianism, as representing the relationship that the practitioner develops with nature. There has to be a connection. There has to be some connection between the shaman and nature, just like there is between the mistletoe and the host tree in terms of the hostorium. So when you look at the tissues of a hostorium under a microscope, as I think I said, you can see how amazingly closely merged the root of the mistletoe is and the host tree is. It's hard to tell which is which. And so if you think of this as parasitical action, it's not quite right. If you say that the mistletoe is a parasite on the host tree, it has a kind of negative implication. But also, if you think of human beings as a parasite on nature, that would be a very, very similar kind of statement. And this is what I mean by the influence of the miasma and the way that we think about these things. It's not actually true. And there are things that mistletoe bring to the host tree that are beneficial to the host tree in the way that there are things that human beings can bring to the world and shamans can bring to the world that are beneficial to nature. And one of those, for instance, is that mistletoe draws in the birds. It draws in birds and other wildlife. Those birds and other wildlife can act as guardians, if you like, of the tree. Birds that eat the seeds are there, but they're also aiding in the dispersal of the pollen. They're also providing fertilizer for the soil that the tree's growing in terms of the birds' droppings. And they're so do you follow me? The birds are actually bringing a lot of benefits to the tree. And the birds wouldn't be there without the mistletoe. That's the key point. The mistletoe is also contributing to the overall ecosystem by providing food and shelter for various species within the environment. Trees are K-types. They do not exist in isolation. They grow within a complex ecosystem, and the maintenance of that ecosystem is assisted by the mistletoe. And as I've said, the medicinal use of mistletoe and the spiritual use of mistletoe in early communities would prevent, because, Britain was deforested very early. When you go over the Pennines from, as you know well, Joe, from Leeds over to Manchester, you see how bare a lot of that land is. That was all forested. That was all forested back in the day.
Yeah.
In those early communities, if a tree was the kind of tree where mistletoe grew, there's no way they'd be cutting that tree down. They'd be cutting a different tree down. That's another way that mistletoe protected the tree from humans. So in becoming a shaman, you have to develop your own hostorium. And this is key to what we've been talking about on recent episodes of the Woven Energy podcast. We've been talking about energy changes that you can embody in your shamanic technique at level 4. And, you learn them at level 3 and you start creating a weave, a guruk out of them at level 4. That weave you can think of as your side of that hostorium. It's the bit that's going to go down into the bark of the tree and connect to the tree's tissues. The level 5 technique is when your weave connects with the spiritual xylem and phloem of the host tree being the world tree.
You drink of the water
and lies
of the world tree.
And that's how the shamaness Miki described it. She called it the jikimutsu, the heavenly dew that you drink of from nature. And so Level 5 technique is about the part where your hostorium that you're developing through your level 4 technique starts to bed down into the tissues, the xylem and the phloem, the energy weave that exists within nature. And that's why mistletoe is such a great analogy for what goes on in higher level shamanic technique, because you want it to, that the guruk that you're creating in your level 4 technique, the energy changes, and we're not done with energy changes, incidentally, there will be lots more level 4 episodes to come. But just to give a preview of the kind of technique that we will be talking about when we get to level 5, this is what it's all about. It's those crossover points between the weave, your hostorium, rather than using your weave, let's call it your hostorium that you're creating with your spirit dance or your other level 4 technique. The crossing points, the points where they lie alongside the xylem and phloem of the host tree, of the world tree, those crossing points start to become, I don't know where to describe it because it's not a thing that's visual, but they start to become brighter. They start to glow or become the main thing that exists within your spirit dance when you start getting really good at it. They start to take over from your weave, the energy patterns, which, at level 3 and level 4, that weave is to a large extent being created under your own initiative as a shaman, as a practicing shaman. But through the internalization of the level 4 technique, say it's spirit dance or something else, you get good at that. You become practiced with it so that you dissolve within it. You completely dissolve within it. These crossing points of your weave and the weave of nature become more and more obvious to you. And this is where level 5 technique starts. You start building a meaningful historium. We've called those crossing points the vessel, right? That's what we call them in the past. I was going to ask you,
yeah. It's like, yes. And we've used the term, it's almost like weaving a structure together.
Well, that's what you're doing with your level 4 technique. But what I'm saying is you're weaving that structure. Nature, before you ever arrived, has woven a structure of its own in which your structure starts participating in the same
intertwining with to create the vessel.
Intertwining with, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's through that interaction that the vessel is created. You don't create the vessel. Nature doesn't really create the vessel. Well, it does in a sense because you come from nature and you're going back to a more natural state, but it doesn't create the vessel deliberately. It's that crossover, it's that interaction between the two sides in the same way that the mistletoe and the tissues of the tree interact. It's the building of that historium, that vessel, is a joint, it arises jointly from the action of the shaman and from the action of nature participating together in a holistic sense. And without either one, it couldn't exist. And so the sense of this commonality in the spirit dance technique where both you and nature are dancing together with increasingly strong and increasingly obvious to you points of crossover between you and shared between you, the I, the me, starts to go away. That through this historium, to a certain extent, like the placenta and the baby, connecting the baby to the mother inside the womb, at that point in time, in a certain way, they're not separate from each other, the mother and the child. They are together, in a sense that the shaman becomes together with nature through the level 5 technique. So obviously level 5 technique builds upon level 4 technique. It builds upon those crossover points in the weave. But you can see this is the start of the spirit of the shaman through their level 4 technique, co-creating the vessel, the hostorium and world tree and shaman all being one and the same thing, or gradually becoming one and the same thing. And slipping onto that vessel is what enables the higher levels of shamanic technique. The ability to slip onto that vessel, in that it goes from being an attachment to nature to being the be-all and end-all of what is happening in the shamanic technique. But the shaman is no longer the driving force, the sole driving force behind the activity as they have been up to level 4. Nature is as much a driving force as the shaman is. That's probably the best way to put it. And so the analogy of the mistletoe and its historium to the host tree and the shaman and the shaman's level 5 technique and the world tree, it's the same thing. They're becoming one and the same thing, but they're not fully there yet. There's not a full dissolution. That's level 7, right? There's not this full dissolution within nature, within the world tree. But there is a crossover. There is a placenta. There is a historium between the two. And when you start practicing level 5 techniques, we're going to do a few more level 4 techniques before we get onto level 5 and start introducing level 5 techniques. But that is their purpose, is to increase the degree of that, is to move you to a point where you've formed a connection. You can start to detect, see, feel, experience these crossover points, and they're becoming increasingly, if you think of it in visual terms, they're becoming increasingly bright, although it's not a visual thing.
A long time ago, Damon, I remember you talking about level 5 and the vessel, and you said, forgive me if my memory is a bit off, but you said something along the lines of that it will be immediately obvious to you. It's something that when it happens, it's just obvious what it is.
It's very obvious, and until you succumb to your natural inclination as a miasmatic human being, say, what does this mean? As soon as you think that, it all collapses. Yeah. Yes. But as long as you don't do that, it will persist. Yeah. And that's, the what does it mean question is something you've got to stay away from as a shaman, especially if I know we have a lot of people who've been practicing the technique for a long time. Some of our patrons, bless them, they post videos and stuff of them doing their spirit dance, and it looks amazing, absolutely amazing. That because remember the conversation we had, can you actually learn shamanism from podcasts? And I was pretty dead set certain that you couldn't early on. I'm not so sure anymore. I'm absolutely not so sure anymore after all this time. So Joe was right and I was wrong. That's the potential.
It's a case of where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
And I think
but that's the point of level 5 technique, is to amplify that, to magnify it, to sink into the historium further and further and further. And once that starts to become, you think of the historium firmly rooting itself, growing and growing and firmly rooting itself within a tree, you can think of that as the shamanic pathway moving along the shamanic pathway, or the esotericist because they have the same concept in Rosicrucianism, moving along the esoteric pathway, becoming more and more embedded within nature. And sure, like the historium isn't the be-all and end-all of the mistletoe, just like the bark that the historium goes through and the xylem and phloem that it joins with are not the be-all and end-all of the tree. Sure, the historium in the vessel is not the be-all and end-all of the shaman, and the world, the world tree's part of the vessel is not the be-all and end-all of the world tree, but it does form that point of connection, and that is what level 5 technique is absolutely all about, is that historium-like connection that happens through long and dedicated practice of shamanic technique, or without long and dedicated practice shamanic technique, if you happen not to live in a civilized, settled society with lots of religious miasma and stuff, and other types of miasma putting you. But this is the word that we've used a lot early on in the podcast. We use this word modoch. We said the ability to mount, to slip onto the vessel. Well, here's so you think of a vessel as like we told the story about the Chilean, the vessels, the Chinese unicorn, where the shaman rides on the back of the Chilean off to the underrealm. That's showing it in terms of a children's sort of story or an old myth or something, isn't it? But the mistletoe, here's something that actually does this, right? Mistletoe does this for real in the real world, solid fact. that the mistletoe does create this incredibly close and intimate connection with the host tree, which is exactly what the shaman's trying to do.
I just find it fascinating how it's no coincidence that it's become this sort of revered item that we find these things, don't we, to make these connections back to nature somehow.
Well, it's also had that. It's also had that secondary use, hasn't it, in Western civilization? It's the combating of prudishness, right? The Victorians are famously prudish, but then if we look at what they actually did, it was all on the surface, wasn't it? They were definitely not prudish behind closed doors, and the mistletoe, that whole. You think of that other. Again, it's about joining. It's about bringing people together. The two leaves of the mistletoe, they sort of represent the union between two people, don't they? Like a couple getting together. And the leaves sort of oppose each other, but they lean towards each other. That's a great symbol. And maybe that's why it's also been used in this kind of connecting or joining symbol within shamanic and esoteric traditions. The mistletoe in a prudish society, which is heavily miasmatic, which is, Christianity was making people feel far worse about themselves during the Victorian era than it does today, but probably still makes people feel quite bad about themselves. It's the whole Adam and Eve and the fig leaves thing, right? The bottom line is, if couples don't get together, the human race doesn't perpetuate, right? It just doesn't.
Yeah.
And in a society where it's seen as a bit off to be, kissing somebody, the socially acceptable mechanisms through which that can actually happen, that two people can show each other that they like each other. The institution of the mistletoe at Christmas, in that sense, it has another great joining function within a very prudish society, right? So there's a thing that where mistletoe benefited the Victorians big time, I think.
It's just one connection after another, isn't it? It's quite incredible. So to put this in context, we're talking about stage 5. Stage 5 is the Modoc slipping onto the vessel.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to go into tremendous detail, obviously, but just to put it in context, then stage 6 is the Ailal, the journey.
No, so stage 5 is indeed about creating the vessel and slipping onto the vessel. You see, you don't create the vessel under your own power. You create the guruch to a certain extent under your own power, the weave, right? That's level 4. That's what we've been talking about. And level 3. Level 3, you're learning the technique. Level 4, you're applying the technique, right, to create your own weave. But then through that technique at level 4, you start to experience this crossover with the pre-existing weave that's going on within nature. Yeah. And then those crossover points become the foundation. They become the clay from which, if you want to think, from which the vessel arises on nature's potter's wheel. And that's what level 5 is about, is slipping, allowing that vessel to form, amplifying it and slipping onto it. Yes. Once you've achieved that state, which is it's beyond a deep state of chillicity. It's something beyond that. It's a deep state of chillicity, not just within you and within nature, but it becomes a crossover state where the distinction between you and nature is starting. It hasn't completely vanished, but it's starting to vanish. The distinction between the mistletoe and the tree in the historium is not entirely clear at first glance anyway. So that is indeed what stage 5 is all about. But the journey is a single group of examples of the kind of techniques as a shaman that you can apply having achieved that state of Modoc. Does that make sense?
Okay.
But there are others. Which we're going to talk about.
So, quote unquote, the journey is an example of stage 6.
Yeah, it's a big group of examples. It's a big group of examples because there's a lot of ways to do the examples. But another example of stage 6 technique would be Kamigakari, which was a kind of technique that Miki practiced. So there are other examples of it than just Ailal, which is the famous one, the famous spirit journey. But here we're talking about the real spirit journey, right? which is, not the, imagine you're floating through the clouds. We're not talking about an imaginary spirit journey. We're talking about the real deal here. And it doesn't
the real
involve,
practical shamanism, Damon.
Well, the type of spirit journey that doesn't involve any imagination whatsoever. That's the one the one we're after. And unfortunately, it's not easy. It takes an awful lot of practice. It's a hard thing. I mean, I find going into a proper spirituality quite easy these days. I would never say that I found Ailal easy. It's hard even after these, 30-something years of practicing shamanism. I still don't find it that easy. So it's something that needs a lot of work, especially for people like us. Who are people like us? Well, we don't live in hunter-gatherer societies out in the beautiful nature in the garden as it's described in the Garden of Eden. And we live in houses and offices and streets. And even when we do live in the countryside like me, we have to get away from the computer. We have to get up the hill and get out across the moor, The miasma comes heavily into this room that I'm sitting in right now every day in the form of my work and the people I interact with and all that kind of stuff.
Piped to you through a computer screen.
Yes, I get the miasma, the high bandwidth miasma.
High band, I like that.
Yeah. So, yeah. Yes, I mean, that's pretty much all I wanted to say about Mistletoe. I don't want to start getting into the details of level 5 technique because we haven't done enough level 4 technique to do that yet. But what I did want to do with this one, given that it's Christmas and, goodwill to all men and stuff, and best wishes to everybody that listens to this podcast. You guys are awesome. Keep us going. For the Christmas season is that we've talked about level 4, what's level 5 about? And I think Mistletoe's a good lead into that.
Yeah, what's further along the tunnel?
Yeah.
What's to come? Yeah. For all this hard work that we put in. Fantastic. Well, I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, of course, and a Happy New Year. Been a good episode, Damon. Is there anything else you want to leave us with, or
no?
Call it a day there?
I'll also say Merry Mythras Mass and point people at the Heretics podcast.
Yes, that was last year's, wasn't it? That was I
can't remember which year it was, mate. I think we've done Mythras a few times, but yeah, probably.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, have a good one, guys, and we will see you when we see you.
All the best. Thank you.